So we are carrying on from Barry's talk. This one is entitled The Battery Metals Panel, Innovations and Pitfalls in Building Europe's Integrated Critical Mineral Supply Chain. Snappy title. I'd like to just start with the introductions to the panel, and I think I'm going to ask you each just to do a very 1-minute introduction on yourselves, just so everyone understands your speciality. That's okay for questions later. So if we go left to right, Fiona, would you mind kicking off on that?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this panel. I'm not a specialist, I'm a generalist. I come from a diplomatic background. I'm former ambassador to Chile, former regional ambassador to Latin America, Caribbean for COP26. But I now do consultancy on Latin America and mining, energy and environment, including under the Ambassador Partnership and various other roles.
My name is John Mayer. I started off my career working in a tin mine with a shovel and a sledgehammer. So I've done that bit. So I trained as a mining engineer. I then came into the city. I did a few different things for a few years. But I worked as a strategist at Goldman Sachs. I did a bit of project finance for Samuel Montague, and now I help to run SP Angel, which is a small investment bank, working with about 40 different mining clients, mostly on the AIM market in London. And hopefully you will read our daily reports.
My name is Matt Fernley. Like Tim, I've been around a little bit and many different jobs, mostly on the sell side, buy side, specializing in the mining space. More recently, I'm editor of Battery Materials Review, which is a monthly subscription newsletter focusing on the battery raw materials space, presenter of the Recharge podcast, and I'm also head of research for Westbeck Capital's Volta energy transition hedge fund.
Simon Gardner-Bond, Chief Technical Officer at Techmet Limited. We're a private investment company focused on technology metals across the whole supply chain, from mining, processing, refining, recycling.
Barry.
Yep, I've just heard from me, but I'm responsible for sourcing and origination at Anglo American across base, battery, PGMs and recycling. Been with Anglo American 11 years now. Before that, I had 10 years with a downstream consumer, so Outokumpu, a big stainless steel producer. So I was in Finland for 8 years, and a little bit of time in Sweden, and before that in Sheffield.
Thanks, guys. I should have said I'm a corporate finance lawyer specialising in mining at Gowling WLG. But I'm sure you're more interested in speaking to the panel today. The theme is around Europe and the raw materials, critical raw materials and supply chain in Europe. But I think we probably need to expand that a bit, because Europe is obviously just one area in the world where this is happening. And everyone knows there's a lot of politics in this space. Everyone is trying to grab the critical minerals around the world. So I thought we might try and just start with putting Europe into context and where Europe stands in that supply and demand space within the global race for battery minerals. So I was going to maybe, Fiona, ask you to maybe put some context, given your ambassadorial role around that.
Well, thanks very much, Charles. And I think you've summed it up very well, that we've got a terrible tendency to look at this through a Europe perspective or a UK perspective. But this is fundamentally a global issue and a global competition with shifting geopolitics. And let's remind ourselves kind of why we're interested in all of this. And I originally come from world of policymaking, including in climate issues. And fundamentally, I think the thing that we're all missing is about the urgency of this agenda. And so the time frame we're operating in, we hear everybody talk about net zero, commitments that are made for 2050. But actually, to meet those commitments for 2050, the key decade is this next one. And in fact, lots and lots of targets were set for 2030 at the Glasgow COP26 conference, of which I was part. And so we have this issue that governments all around the world, including our own, are not up to speed on implementing policies to reach those targets. We then have a growing realization of the practicalities actually needed to make that transition. And I spend a lot of space both in the climate world and in the mining world and in the energy world and in the finance world. And it seems to me they're all echo chambers, and perhaps we're guilty of that here, that we focus on our own special world, not about the interrelationships. And so fundamentally, to meet those targets for 2030, we need to go 5 times faster than we are now to reduce emissions in this decade. To do that, obviously predictions vary. There's been various experts talk about this at this conference on the raw materials needed for that transition. But roughly, if we're going to go 5 times faster, we need 5 times more stuff, differentiated between obviously the different minerals and the complexities of supply. So you have a volume issue of supply. You have a, can it be realised fast enough? Is the money going into the system fast enough to make that happen? You also have issues around the location, the increasing concentration in a smaller number of producer countries, which themselves are unstable and vulnerable indeed to climate change. And so what I'm interested in is that balance between volume, location, and urgency. And we're starting to see governments all over the world, including, of course, in Europe, really waking up to this and doing a lot of analysis, developing policies, but there's still not a lot of action between matching that aspiration to the reality of what the sector can produce. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. I'll open the same question to anybody else on the panel if they want to react.
I'll just jump in and say, where is Europe in the global sort of chain? I'd say it's last. It's in last place. And this is quite tragic because 5 years ago, I would say Europe was in second place behind China in terms of the energy transition. But over the last 3 or 4 years, Europe has given up all of that positioning. And it's primarily due to a lack of investment, a lack of recognition of the importance of raw materials. And another key issue is too much bureaucracy. So after the US published the IRA about 14 months ago, Europe came out with a big fanfare, the Critical Raw Materials Act. But to tell you the truth, it just adds another layer of bureaucracy to the whole situation. And, the bulk of companies developing projects in battery raw materials are junior companies. And junior companies can't afford to employ departments full of 20 box tickers to tick all the boxes that are needed to qualify for this European grant funding, etc. So, the EU and Europe is really shooting itself in the foot by adding more and more layers of bureaucracy and regulation, where other countries and regions in the world are removing layers of regulation and making it easier to raise funds to build new battery raw materials projects. So, really, Europe needs to sort itself out because it's very much at risk now of being in last place and finding it practically impossible to build a battery raw materials supply chain.
It may be worth just jumping in there for those of you who aren't familiar with the critical raw materials legislation that's being passed by the European Parliament at the moment, is going through. The figures, just for interest, are that the aim by 2030 is for EU extraction. They expect at least 10% of the EU's annual consumption for extraction. They want 40% consumption for processing from Europe, and at least 15% of the EU's annual consumption from recycling, and no more than 65% of the EU's annual consumption of each strategic raw material, which is a subset of critical raw materials at any relevant stage of processing. So there's some pretty tough targets for Europe to meet there. So I don't know, Simon, is this something you've had to deal with from Techmet's point of view?
We have a couple of investments in Europe, and I'm classing the UK as Europe for this argument. And it definitely has a place. We're a global investor, so we look at a global context. I think Europe's probably got some interesting choices ahead of it. I think everybody in our space, and this is the problem, I think a lot of the legislation is driven from politicians who don't really understand metals and mining. I'm being very broad here, but I think I'm right. And you know, you talk to people in our industry who know how difficult it is to get a metals and mining or processing, refining, recycling project up and running. And we look at these targets and we say, I would say we probably instantly dismiss them and say, no, they're just not going to be achieved. So I think the interesting decisions that I'm referring to coming up are, there are going to be times when we're going to butt up against those self-imposed timescales, self-imposed limits, and we're going to say, okay, so we're not going to achieve them. Are we going to be happy to buy from somewhere else and import? Are we going to import vehicles, modules, cells, you know, whatever it might be? And is anyone going to care? And is the consumer going to care? You know, are emissions, carbon emissions per unit of the thing that you're buying going to be important? I think there's a huge array of things that are coming up that are going to affect how it works. At the end of the day, I think actually the consumer demand or the consumer desires of the product that they're going to be buying are probably going to dictate what's going to happen, which I think is interesting because for us, for metals and mining, because I think up to this point, there hasn't been a connection really between the production and the consumer. And by that, I mean, if you're a copper miner in Chile, you don't really know who's buying the air conditioning unit with the copper. You know, you have no connection there. Whereas with EVs especially, and a lot of the renewable energy hardware, renewable energy battery systems, stuff like that, there is this connection. So I think that's going to change the dynamic somewhat.
Thanks. I mean, one of the points on the talk is where people talk about the supply chain, but the supply chain is quite a complicated thing, right? We talk about the auto manufacturers at one end and the miners at the other, but there's a lot that goes on in between there. There's a lot of different steps. So where are the kind of structural deficits in the implementation of those steps? Where, for example, is Europe sitting? Because it doesn't really have a big mining industry. Yes, it's got loads of car manufacturers. And in the processing, there's very little processing, well, at least as far as I'm aware. So which areas has Europe really got to concentrate on to address that? John?
I think you've answered your question.
Okay.
In that it's that middle stage processing that's really lacking. And yes, we do know people who are working on developing that. I mean, if you look at graphite for graphite anodes for lithium-ion batteries, Umicore are definitely ramping up what they're doing, and they've been supplying Duracell for years, so they do know what they're doing. But we don't see much news on who else is doing that. You ought to see other big chemical companies, maybe INEOS and guys like that doing it, Johnson Matthey. But Johnson Matthey pulled out of most of what they were doing in lithium-ion batteries, which is a bit of a shame. So yeah, we're falling way behind. We know some guys who are looking at doing lithium refining in Germany, and the Germans are backing that. But I mean, the European Parliament seems to be deluded when it comes to all these targets that they've been setting. China is so far ahead. They have been, to use an expression, balls to the wall on this, and really driving it very hard with what looks like unlimited finance. And now they're starting to turn the screw. Could you use another expression there? But they are turning the screw in that they're starting to withhold certain commodities, particularly within the more processed end of what we need for lithium-ion batteries. So they say, yes, we can have synthetic graphite, which is the more expensive and lesser quality product. And it's our fault because we are so far behind on, we could develop more graphite mines. If I look around this room, I see certain people who've been involved with these sorts of projects in Europe, but those projects are stalled for various reasons. It is, yes, the bureaucracy. If you wanted to build a mine in France, just forget it. I mean, you might upset some chickens somewhere with your geosensing. And I'm serious, that is a key issue for the French. In Germany, it's still very difficult. In Sweden, next to impossible, but maybe it's getting easier. The Europeans, they've got so much technical know-how, and they have done this in the past, but there seem to be so many impediments. And when it comes to people investing in these things, it's quite hard to put your hand on your heart and say, yes, you should invest in this. It'll be in production next year, because chances are that somebody called Greta is going to get in the way. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Barry, in your previous talk, you had a really good slide with the auto manufacturers and what they were doing. Do they understand that if you're a European auto manufacturer, if you've got to create a European supply chain, that this is going to be hard, or are they just ignoring that and they're going to get their supply chain based globally in any case?
I think it depends on the auto manufacturer, and I think some have, really understand the challenge and the scale of the opportunity and the combined problem, and are looking to address that. And you were seeing quite big capital investments by certain auto companies. Others are, less aware of those challenges in the future. And I think, the US, I think, has moved ahead quite a lot, and they use US-based manufacturers with the era. That's been quite successful in, I think, incentivizing the build out of that downstream in the country. And I think if you compare and contrast the approach from the US and Europe, the US are really incentivizing people to do something. If you do this, you will get a fiscal benefit. Whereas Europe, it's more of a punishment system. It seems if you don't do this, you will incur fines and penalties. So I think the US is obviously ahead. And if you look at then the different mining projects in US-friendly countries like Australia and so forth, I think they've really benefited from that plan. And also then, I spoke with some battery makers quite soon after the era was announced, and that really improves the profitability of making batteries in the US versus elsewhere. So they were seriously considering moving their already planned investments in Europe to the US. That's how bigger impact that has.
I guess
Can I pick up something Barry said? You said that the OEMs have made significant capital investments. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, if you compare how much they've invested in supply of materials compared to how much they invested in battery and EV manufacturing, it's peanuts. Yeah. I think this wave of capital has to come. I actually think that they're behind the knowledge curve. I think the OEMs, there are some who are ahead of others, but I think as a group, if I was to characterize a group, I would say there's still the light bulb moment has to go off. I don't think it has gone off yet. I think when you look at the money that needs to be spent to provide metals and materials that we're talking about for these sort of things like the European regulations, I don't think they're anywhere near yet.
I think that the problem that the OEMs are suffering is that these are still very small markets. And I think OEMs are used to dealing with big markets when it comes to commodities like steel and aluminium, where they can turn around to their suppliers and say, look, I have a 10,000 tons less steel this month or 10,000 tons more aluminium. But the lithium market's not like that. The graphite market's even smaller. Manganese is even smaller than that. So I think the auto companies are still struggling. And, this far down the line, five years down the line, I think, since this started to be an issue, we're also seeing quite a high turnover in the purchasing departments of these auto companies. And, you talk to junior miners and they're educating the OEMs, but they're having to educate now the second or third group of purchasing managers in these departments. And it's a real problem that there's such a lack of understanding of the length of the supply chain amongst OEMs. So I think that I agree. I want to see the capital coming from the OEMs. At the moment, they're spending something like 10 times more on the downstream part of the industry than the capital that's available in the upstream part of the industry. We need to see more flowing into upstream, whether that's from OEMs, whether it's from the cell industry, whether it's from governments, but it's just not happening. The other issue that's a big issue in both Europe and the US is planning. So it takes way too long to build these things. Even elsewhere in the energy transition, we were reading a story recently. It took 10 years to get planning permission to build an interconnector in the US. It could take 10 or 15 years to get permission to build a mine. So, we've got to streamline planning if we're really serious about hitting our energy transition targets. Because if we don't, there's no chance. I mean, it's difficult. It's touch and go anyway. But if we don't transition these planning protocols, no chance at all. Not even by 2040.
I guess it sounds like it's pretty worrying. Is Europe doing anything right? Are there any countries that are actually improving the supply chain, who've made some real advances, and which you've seen? I mean, the people have made investments in Europe, so they must think there is something happening there. So is there any particular one that stands out?
I think the UK is actually standing out. If you look at the support for regenerating the tin industry in Cornwall, look at what's going up with the polyhalite in North Yorkshire, other government support. That government support doesn't go much beyond, shall we say, consulting and feasibility study type work. So it would be good to see the UK government step up and support more tangible capital investment. But I have the feeling that will come, especially if the industry calls for it and there are sensible projects. But the UK investors have certainly been very supportive.
I still think there's the potential to do a lot more. I would agree that the UK is making progress, that we saw the strategy come out over a year ago and refreshed last March, but that really lacks specifics. We're starting, I think, to see more international partnership agreements also coming forward with Japan, with the US. There is a special agreement underway. There's been visits to Mongolia. So things are happening, but whether they're happening fast enough. I do think the UK also has a great opportunity with the strength of the City of London and its already declared ambition to be a global hub for green finance. I think there's a lot more the city could do to actually help galvanise investment in this sector. And also we've got the strength of the UK research base and initiatives being taken by Innovate UK and UCRI and others. So I think there is progress, but whether it's enough and whether it's fast enough and whether it's strategic enough is a big question.
Any other views?
I think you have to look on a project by project basis, on a country by country basis. So John alluded to the movements in Sweden that we're seeing on the graphite side. Hopefully we will see permission for a startup of a graphite mine. Finland's adding a lithium mine and processor, but it's still very, very difficult in other parts of Europe. You know, many of us have been tracking a lithium project in Portugal for the last 5 years. Still running into huge planning and environmental issues, you know, and lack of support from local and national government. You know, other projects, manganese projects, lithium projects in Central Europe, in Czech Republic, in Germany, in Austria, still struggling to get through the planning procedures and very opaque. So, you know, it's these planning, it's the opacity of these planning procedures and the length of time which is really holding Europe back, I would say.
Okay. One of the things I thought we might also talk about was the targets on the other end of the spectrum, which is the recycling end. Barry, you had I think a slide on this around recycling, how that can play a part in the supply chain or the end of the supply chain, the second life of some of these minerals. Do the panel think this is it's too early to really concentrate on that because we haven't actually got to the stage where there's enough supply for the recycling, or should we be looking at that now as well?
The biggest opportunity in recycling for batteries at the moment is in production scrap. So that's I think recycling locations, co-locations, corporations with the battery producers or the car makers is where the bigger volumes will come. I think you know, as you said, the batteries in vehicles are lasting longer than people originally anticipated. There will be a second life for some of those. That's solution is maybe not available to the public yet. When I was looking to get battery energy storage at home, then I would love to be able to take an EV battery and stick it on my garage wall. But I don't think quite there yet. It's being used in the the energy storage sector quite a lot in to support solar farms and wind power, I think, but not for the consumer sector yet. But hopefully that will come in the future. But end of life is some way off, I think, in bigger volumes to make a difference.
I'm surprised you put a second-hand EV battery in your house. I definitely wouldn't. I think that's going to be garage, even garage. I mean, I definitely wouldn't, and I would not recommend anyone to do the same. I think it's going to be a major issue going forward. I think Second Life is not going to be as significant as many people say. It's going to be for a lot of reasons, insurance being one of them. And also the availability of recycling is not there. You're right. The fundamental thing is that recycling lithium-ion batteries is hard. It is a difficult thing to do. Technically, it is very difficult. And we're seeing this now. There are recycling companies that are really struggling. But I do think, directly answer your question, should we be doing it? Yes, because it takes a long time to develop the technology so that we can be in a position to be able to recycle the batteries when that wave of material comes. Yeah, you're right. Barry's right. Manufacturing waste is essentially the only real volume source. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, we can use that as the sort of stepping stone to get the technology right so that we're ready for the end of life batteries. But there is an interesting economic dynamic as well with the price of EVs, because OEMs at the moment are putting a price onto the vehicle that you're buying to account for the disposal of what is essentially a hazardous waste at the moment. As soon as, and because we haven't sort of crossed that Rubicon of recycling being available to the OEMs such that they can rely on that. And then when we do cross that, there'll be, I think, a bit of a sort of a flip of a switch where they'll suddenly say, well, we can actually view that as an asset and not a liability, and so we can reduce the price. And that, I think, will be a real acceleration in EV adoption again, beyond what we're seeing now, where people will, they can reduce the cost suddenly overnight by a few £1,000s, few $1,000s, and they'll be competitive not just on a use case, but on a on the forecourt price as well. So there's some interesting dynamics, but we should definitely stick at it, I think.
So in the words of Donald Rumsfeld, there are some known knowns and some unknown unknowns, and I won't go into the rest of it. But in an ideal world, when you feel you've had enough out of your battery pack in your car, you'd be able to take those batteries out, store them in a little building that is not in your house, and that will store the power from the solar panels that you almost certainly have to have on your roof. And that would be great for supporting the heat exchangers on the air source or ground source heat pump that you'll be working on. Although it won't be nearly enough energy, but it will help. And it would particularly help the government, which, as we know, is going to be very late on the next generation of nuclear power stations that it hasn't actually started planning or building yet. But, of course, what we don't know is that whether these batteries will actually be accessible from these cars. We don't quite know how long they're all going to last, although what people don't realize is that if you drive a combustion engine car, the actual mileage you'll get out of the tank falls anyway by a certain amount because the engines get less efficient as they get older. Something I learned from Jeremy Clarkson some years ago on that program he does. So they suffer all the same issues. Electric vehicles will be more reliable, which would be great. It may be that you'll be able to swap the batteries in and out, hopefully without too much trouble. And then question is, well, how many of those will get used for Second Life? I think a lot of them will, so that'll be a problem for the recyclers. The recyclers will get all the batteries that have been in accidents, and probably might not have to have such a serious accident to get the batteries out. And then who gets those batteries? Well, they'll go into the scrap merchants. So they'll be the guys running the recycling process rather than anyone else. So it's interesting because we've been looking at different companies and who do you finance going forwards from a recycling perspective? Will it be the car companies or will it be the recycling companies? And I think I'll put my money with the recyclers for now.
I would caution that I think there's been a little bit of an overinvestment in recycling in the near term. As my colleagues have mentioned, there's not an awful lot of material available in the system, and there's particularly been an overinvestment in the first stage of recycling, which is effectively breaking up the battery into the black mass. At this stage, the actual recycling processing, whether that's hydromet or pyromet processing, is not being done as effectively So we do need to see investment in the actual processing and the recycling. But I definitely think there's been an overinvestment in the breaking down of the battery part of the recycling area. It could be 10 or 15 years until there be enough material available for all of the investments that have been made. So I think there's going to be some interesting trends, shall we say, in the next 5 or 6 years with companies that will not be able to generate a return or high enough return on their capital.
Would you apply the same theories to magnets as well, for magnet recycling? Into rare earths, for example?
I haven't looked into that in that degree, no.
Anybody else?
Yeah, so recycling, I think, is certainly a very important part of the equation. But as the other panelists have highlighted, it's not that simple. More innovation and technology is needed. But also, I think it's very important that governments are rather pinning their hopes that this will solve some of the supply problems. And again, it comes down to the time frame, that's probably not going to happen sufficiently to such an extent that it's going to meet the supply demands in the next 10 to 15 years. And I mean, again, on aspiration, I think we saw last week on the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, that then became in UK parlance negotiated text. And one of the great things that they put into that was now the target's gone up from 15% to 25% recycling, which again is a great aspiration. But where is the policy action to actually make that a reality?
And the other, I guess, thing to take into account, which is very topical, is ESG, is you've got to make these supply chains ESG compliant for sustainability as well. I think, Barry, you mentioned that in your talk around getting that supply chain ESG compliant. Is that something you think Europe can do successfully?
I think there was a good point made earlier around giving consumers the opportunity to choose. And I think at the moment it's, as a potential buyer of an EV, it's very difficult to even see what battery chemistry is in that EV. I'm a bit of a geek, so I like to look at these things. So that's very difficult. But ideally, you would inform the consumer of then the carbon footprint of that battery and of that vehicle, and that's part of the tool. We have launched value tracks to at least give the downstream customer that data and a level of insight which can be passed on to the consumer if they so wish. But I think there is a big portion of consumers, an increasing portion of consumers who are interested in those metrics, and I think that would be valuable then to steer consumer choice rather than having it mandated by governments and consumers will.
It'd be like going to a Sainsbury's, getting the stuff with the red tractor on. When you go and buy your car, you can find one whatever what the equivalent is for an EV.
Yeah, and there's the industry, or I would say sort of the Global Battery Alliance, for example, which was spun out of the World Economic Forum. They are working on this global battery passport, but it's a very big undertaking, a very complex undertaking, but progress has been made on those fronts, hopefully.
And are there certain battery chemistries that are more likely to be more ESG compliant? Things without cobalt, for example, or then if there are any that are particularly off limits, or are they all very much the same?
That is one aspect, and I think then the other is the location of where those raw materials are produced and converted. So countries with high coal generation is going to be bigger on the CO2 footprint.
Well, it's quite likely that things like lithium iron phosphate, lithium manganese iron phosphate are going to be more ESG, easier to comply, shall we say, than the NCM, nickel, cobalt, manganese. And I wonder how many consumers really know what sort of battery chemistry they're going to get in their electric vehicle. And even fewer would probably understand that. The implications are that probably if it's more likely to be legislation that drives it. In China, they brought in particularly stringent legislation on the potential for battery fires in cars. there's a certain amount of time in which you have to be able to get a baby out of a child seat in a back car, for example. And that has driven Chinese manufacturers to go for simpler chemistries like lithium iron phosphate, which are less dangerous than NCM. We in the West are still more on NCM batteries because of the higher power density. All this will change, of course, going forwards as people develop new higher power density batteries in safer chemistries. So I don't want to make forecasts here, but so we say the great thing is that battery densities are improving and safety appears to be improving as well.
I would say that there's a lot of hot air spoken on ESG that's not necessarily backed up by the reality. You know, we talk about sort of nickel, cobalt, manganese. Everybody's all about reducing the amount of cobalt that's in batteries because of the issues, specific issues with the DRC. But a lot of European OEMs, US OEMs, are happy to invest in Indonesian nickel, which produced using very dirty power, which dry stacks the tailings in a high rainfall area, in an area that's seismically active. You know, it amazes me that a European OEM is happy to invest in a project like that, but is not happy to invest in cobalt from the DRC. And I think because there's a lack of understanding of ESG through the supply chain, it's going to come around and bite some of these organizations on the backside over the next 5 to 10 years. You know, just look at a satellite picture for Indonesia next to a nickel mine and tell me that there's no pollution there. And I'll show you a blind man every time. But this is a real problem, and it's going to come around and it's going to bite the industry on the backside because they still don't understand the supplier exposure of their supply chain. And I think that people really need to be aware of not just what the chemistry is, but also where the raw material is being produced, where it's being taken to, where it's being processed, where it's being taken onto, where that's being processed, and even beyond that. So I think, you know, there's lots of companies that I think could do an awful lot better on ESG that talk a really good story in the market and perhaps don't dance the dance in reality.
I would very much agree with all of that. But I think these pressures for responsible sourcing, they will both be driven by consumers, but also driven by governments, because governments will want to ensure the security of their supply chain. But in turn, that means the pressures are going to increase on those supply chains. And then also there's still an awful lot of developments that are needed to actually address the transparency of the supply chain of data, information, traceability. To what extent is that information shared across different countries? How do you sort all of that out? I think those are all still big questions to be addressed.
Okay, well, we've got a few more minutes, so we should open it up to the floor here in case you've got any questions.
Yeah, just coming back to well, European supply versus, say, friendly African supply. It seems to me, partly because of the Portuguese example, which I think many of us are well aware of, that it's not really a governmental level thing in many cases. It's also just local opposition to projects. And that incidentally applies to housing in the UK as well. I mean, it's not just in the mining space. And it doesn't even mean majority local opposition. It just means determined local opposition. It can sometimes be a determined local minority who want to block a project. But because they're focused and noisy, they can block it almost indefinitely. And that's a political problem which the politicians don't really want to address because it's not compatible with inclusive democratic politics. You actually need to effectively sort of crush that local opposition if you want these projects to go ahead. And so it might be easier for Europe to agree that to certify supplies from friendly African countries like, I don't know, Namibia, Botswana, those sort of places which seem to be reasonably decent societies doing things in a reasonably good way and which don't have undue Chinese influence. So I suppose there's two questions in there. One, I mean, Fiona, with your political side on, do you want to stamp on this local opposition, or do you want to switch to supply from places like Africa, which are not perhaps the DRC, but some other parts of Africa, where you might have a sort of a more enthusiastic local response to development?
I think a very good question. I don't think you can stamp on the issue of community opposition. That's always going to be there, and is certainly also a feature of Latin America, which I know much more about than Africa. So it's about how do you change that narrative around. But it's also about governments forging partnerships with key friendly countries in Africa, in Latin America. And we're still not seeing enough of that. We're seeing lots of agreements between different Western countries. The Mineral Security Partnership, led by the US, for example, is busy trying to stitch up various supply chains. But the real missed opportunity is to reach out to the key countries in Africa, in Latin America, and forge partnership agreements that also bring benefits to those producer countries that in turn will address at least some of the local opposition. So another dimension to this is, of course, the whole public awareness and public acceptability of mining, on which there is a long, long way to go to shift that narrative. And this comes down to a broader understanding of basically how mining affects all our lives, but also all our futures, and in turn, the increasing risks we're all running with the rising risks from climate change impacts. But shifting that dialogue quickly is very, very difficult.
It's an age-old problem, the PR of the mining industry. Well, we're not going to answer that, I don't think, in, 38 seconds. So I'm going to sum up and say thank you very much to our panel, to Barry.
Sure, can I?
Sorry. Yeah, you're going to answer that.
No, I just wanted to ask a question before you go, because
Yeah.
I've been on this panel. I think this is my 4th year of the panel at the one-to-one conference about battery metals. I think Philip's been in every audience. I asked a question 4 years ago. I'm going to ask it again. Can anyone who drives an EV or a hybrid, could you put your hand up? Okay, can you can keep your hands up if you, but is there anybody who might be changing the car in the next, say, 12 months and would consider an EV or a hybrid as opposed to a petrol or a diesel? Yeah, I did this 4 years ago and there were not many. I would say it's probably about double. I think it was 5% before. Looks like it's more like 10% now.
Well, they're getting cheaper.
It's getting there.
Yeah.
It's actually lower than I was expecting, which is interesting, I think, because this is, let's be frank, you're all quite a privileged audience, so you have the ability to choose the vehicle that you're driving.
Any recommendations?
Me? Yeah, I'm driving an Ioniq 5, so I'm now driving one that I wasn't 4 years ago. It's great.
I think it's important to note that it feels like we're in a bear market in the mining sector. And maybe there's not quite as much cash around as there was.
Yeah, true. Maybe next year.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Barry, Simon, Matt, John, Fiona, thank you very much indeed, guys.